everyone, welcome back to High Point again. Today we are going to learn about an apology for poetry by Philip Sidney. So Philip Sidney belongs to the Elizabethan age, and if you want to know more about Philip Sidney and his literary contributions, you can go to the playlist of Elizabethan age and you can watch the video entirely dedicated to Philip Sidney. And apology for poetry also in detail I have given a video there. So here we will look at the important points that Sidney is saying, or Sidney has already said in his work An Apology for Poetry. This will have an introductory section. After that it will be followed by the critical summary of this work. I am not going too deep into this work because already we have done a very elaborate video upon this. So I have picked some important points related to An Apology for Poetry that we will see in this video, which are important that you must know about An Apology for Poetry. Okay, so let's have the introduction. And it's a spirited defense of poetry against all the charges laid against it. So it is actually An Apology for Poetry. There is another title for this work, The Defense of Poesy. So that justifies more of the purpose of this particular work by Sidney, that Sidney wanted to defend poetry against all the charges laid against poetry by various other people like Stephen Gosson. Okay, so and also one of the major purpose of writing this particular or producing The Defense of Poesy is that a person known as Stephen Gosson has written a work known as School of Abuse. So Gosson called poetry as school of abuse in this work known as School of Abuse. So this is an important point. So Defense of Poetry is kind of a response to Stephen Gosson's School of Abuse, and he is actually defending, Sidney is defending poetry against the allegations made by Gosson in his work School of Abuse. Okay, so Gosson stated that a man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry, that it is mother of lies. So this is the major allegation that Gosson made against poetry, or stated against poetry, that a man could spend his time more in other useful subjects. Why should he or she or he study it in particular? Because poetry is mother of lies. So he, as a great poet of the time, Sidney feels a responsibility to justify poetry against the allegations made by such a person known as Gosson. So that's exactly what he does here. Along with, he's actually giving more legitimacy to poetry as a branch of literature, as a branch of studies, and also he critically views the contemporary stage and poetry as well. Sidney said that poetry alone teaches moves to virtue, and therefore a man cannot better spend his time in it. So this is the major response that Sidney gives to Gosson when he made such an allegation. Like, poetry is kind of a thing that actually alone teaches not only about the good virtues, good things and good ideas, but it will move the person to do good virtues or do good deeds and things and all. So therefore a man is not wasting his time on poetry, but a man better learn it to be a good person. Okay, moving on, let's have the critical summary. Here in this work, Sidney is telling many things: how poetry is so vital, how one should learn poetry, what are the merits of poetry, different kinds of poetry, subdivisions of true poetry, and also his responses to the four major allegations against poetry, the reasons for decline of contemporary poetry, and also he tells many things related to contemporary stage and poetry, and how love poetry has lost its eminence in poetry, how mainly he wanted to revive that interest that people had in poetry once. So if you could see Elizabethan age, poetry is not a towering genre there, it was drama. So he could understand that certain reasons led to this decline of taste towards poetry that he wanted to revive as a poet generally in that age among the people, among the poets. And he also critically analyzed how this entire poetry the taste for, or people are not in a way enjoying poetry of the time, what are the reasons led to the decline of contemporary poetry or the then poetry. So many things he is saying in it, and he is also telling about the dictions that as a poet what type of dictions should be used in poetry, and also what type of things a poet should taken care of while writing a poetry. And at the same time he says many things related to rhythm and meter, whether it is necessary and all. So many things he is discussing. So if you want to know a full idea what is happening inside an apology for poetry, you can obviously go and visit my website www.highpoint.in, where you can see an elaborate discussion upon an apology for poetry. And also you can follow me in Instagram. Aliji Maria 90 is my ID. There too I am sharing lot of free materials, and if you also wanted to have a connection with me, you can WhatsApp me in my number here on the screen. You can see my WhatsApp number there. I have a WhatsApp group in which I'm sharing news and updates related to NTU UGC NET, as well as daily quiz questions, its answers, and some study materials. Anyway, I'm sharing more study materials and quiz questions in my Instagram ID. So if you are also there, then you can follow me there if you want. Let's move on to the critical summary. So mainly he says about antiquity of poetry. So he start defending poetry by telling its antiquity, its ancientness. Poetry in all nations preceded other branches of learning. So before the emergence of any other branch of study in any other nation, any other land, poetry was there before any other branch of knowledge. And poets are poetry was there. Poets can be called as the father of learnings, and also must be respected for their antiquity. For this reason you have to respect poets. And in the ancient times, even though historical documents or scientific documents or any other kind of documents were preserved and written in poetry only. Okay, if you could understand that. And philosophers and historians appeared under the mask of poets. See, philosophical treatise, historical treatise, medical treatise, or any other kind of treatise and write-ups always appeared under the mask of poets. The beauty of Plato's work depends upon poetry. So Plato, Aristotle, these people are great philosophers, and if you could see their original work, all of them are written like a poetic treatise, even though they are telling some philosophical things or historical things they are telling. So basically why their works got so popular and people liked to read them and enjoy them, because primarily all these philosophers were writing their works in poetical mode. So after telling about the antiquity of poetry, he moves about telling the universality of poetry, the universality of poetry. So poetry has flourished all ages and countries, even in the uncivilized. So among the uncivilized too, poetry was there. So people who do not have any written script or alphabets, or whether they are barbarians, they enjoy poetry. And poetry alone actually moved their hearts to more humanizing kind of thoughts, and poetry also played a great role in civilizing them. So poetry also sharpened their wit, okay, even though they are uncivilized. So everywhere on this planet, poetry was there at the beginning of civilization, or after the beginning of civilization, poetry emerged. That's the antiquity of poetry. And everywhere else on this planet it is like that. So that shows the universality of poetry. Universal veneration of poets and poetry. So since poetry was there in the beginning, and poetry is universal in a sense, so universally everywhere poets got respected along with their poetry. So both Greeks and Romans honored poets. So Greeks and Romans, they were from the ancient times itself, they were civilized people. Their civilization is famous, and they are famous for their knowledge and all. So both Greeks and Romans, they honored poets. And in Rome, poets were called as vats. Okay, vats literally means prophet. That word vats mean prophet. And in Greek too, they used a particular word which actually means a maker or a creator. Okay, so that's how they have given respect to poets and their poetry. And also the oracles. So in Greek and Rome, you know that the priest, they will deliver all oracles of Apollo, oracles of Delphi. So you know, you are familiar with this kind of things in Greek drama and Roman drama. So the oracles were delivered in verse form. So there need to be they need to have a poet to, you know, actually tell the meaning, or you know, unearth the meaning of these oracles to the kings or to the people out there. So poets, they were actually given utmost veneration and respect everywhere. In the Bible too, Holy David himself was a poet. So he is a poet. Holy David himself is a poet. So it would be wrong to condemn poets and poetry in that way too. Now he goes on discussing about poetry, its long continuity. Since it was there from the beginning, it is also long lasting, and it is not going to end anywhere, because still poetry is there. People are enjoying poetry, people are having fun with this literary genre, poetry, and poetry is a very powerful vehicle to convey many meanings and carry out many things. So poetry is long lasting, as it also began at the very beginning. So it begins early in the history of nations and lasts the longest. So we can see that as time passes, many branch of studies disappeared and many took another form, and many changed its appearance, and you know, many changes happened throughout. But poetry also, even though it was changing, it was not disappearing, it was evolving from good to better to best. Okay, so it is long lasting. Now he tells about the function and nature and definition of poetry. Sidney is now telling about the definition of poetry, its nature and function. So like Plato and Aristotle and Horace, he is also telling that poetry is an art of imitation. So it mainly imitates the reality of a higher kind. It is not imitating the absolute fact or absolute reality, but it imitates a kind of universal or abstract reality, which is at the same time pleasing too. And poetry is speaking picture. So he defines poetry as a speaking picture, which actually before us, it draws a picture in it through its words, and its end is to teach and delight. So like many other philosophers, Sidney also tells us that the main end of poetry is to instruct and delight. So he tells first to teach. That means poetry should be instructional, at the same time it should be delightful to the soul of the readers. Now here comes one of the most important points that he makes in this apology for poetry, that he divides poetry into three broad divisions. So he gives three broad divisions to the poetry. First one is religious poetry, and second one is philosophical or informative poetry, and third one is the right or true kind of poetry. So from here, from the title religious poetry itself, you can understand that it will be hymns and, you know, poetry written for praising God. Such kind of religious poetry are there, and there is nothing wrong in composing such kind of poetry. And second one is philosophical or informative kind of poetry, in which it actually imparts knowledge about various branches of studies like economy, history, philosophy, science, or social, or you know, many kind of knowledges are imparted there in philosophical or informative poetry, and this is also pretty much useful. And third one is the right or true kind of poetry. So the poets who are writing these kind of poetry are the true makers of poetry. Even though philosophical or informative poetry and religious poetry are there, but still true or right kind of poetry, the people or the poets who are writing this kind of poetry, they are the true makers of poetry. And this right or true kind of poetry is divided into heroic, lyric, tragic, comic, satiric, iambic and pastoral. So these kind of divisions are there for the right or true kind of poetry. I am not going to discuss elaborately about each of these divisions because I have already done that in the previous video that I have given there, which is also about an apology for poetry in the session where we discussed about Elizabethan literature. You can go and watch it. I will give link there in the description box as well as in the I button too. So you can watch it, or you can go to my website and have even more elaborately simplified data about an apology for poetry, Philip Sidney and Philip Sidney's other works as well. So Philip Sidney is a great poet too. He has come up with many more important works. So if you want to have a really comprehensible and simplified study materials, then obviously you can go and have that, all of that in the website there, and you can have the free trial and see, and if you are interested you can join us. So after joining us you will get 2 bonuses, weekly test in every Saturdays and as well as personalized study guidelines. Okay, now moving on, Philip Sidney in his An Apology for Poetry says that the end of learning is best served by poetry. So this point in the introduction as well we have discussed that. He says that, see, every other discipline, what is the purpose of every other subject or science or whatever subjects that we are learning? So it is not only that the subject will give, or the discipline will give you some sort of knowledge about something, but it should lead that person who is studying it to good actions, right? So that is the end of every other learning. Not only it imparts some sort of knowledge, but true learning should give as kind of self-knowledge, as well as it should move the person to do good actions, right? But science is not capable enough to move people into doing good actions. That's what he is saying. Science do not serve the true end of learning, which is self-knowledge and which leads to good action. So science may, different kinds of branches of science, they may be serving knowledges, imparting knowledges, different types of knowledges to people, but they are not serving the true end of learning, which is self-knowledge, and that self-knowledge will lead that person to good action, virtuous actions. So this end of learning that move people to virtuous action is best served by poetry. Poetry not only conveys higher level of knowledges, but it have the power to move people or lead people to virtuous actions. So poetry is conducive to good action. Poetry is not only gives us knowledge of virtue, but also moves us to virtuous action because it conveys truth in a delightful manner. How can a poetry such a power of moving people into doing good actions or virtuous actions? Because it presents the truth in a delightful manner that a science cannot do, that a branch of study about science, any other subject cannot do. So delightful presentation of facts and knowledge can only be done by poetry. That's how poetry is powerful enough to move the persons into doing virtuous actions. I hope that was clear. It wins the mind from wickedness to virtue, as it teaches more perfectly than either history or philosophy. See, in history too you can find people doing great deeds, stories of great persons. In philosophy too, it actually conveys many aspects about life, realities and all. But still, more than history and philosophy, poetry can win a person's mind to virtue from wickedness, because it is delightfully presenting every other truth and higher level of truth to them. So that's why poetry is capable to move people's heart into virtuous actions, unlike history or philosophy. That's why previously, in the beginning, ancient times, historians and philosophers, they made themselves conveyed to people in the disguise of poetry or poets. Okay, the next session where Sidney is actually giving relevant replies to 4 allegations or charges made against poetry, especially by Stephen Gosson in his work School of Abuse. Okay, let's look at the first one. Poetry is useless and is a waste of time. There are other more fruitful knowledges. A man better spend his time in them than in poetry. Okay, so this was the first allegation, that poetry is useless. Why should somebody study poetry? So there are better knowledges than poetry. Poetry is just like, some fancies going on there. So why should anybody spend their time, their precious time on studying poetry? People can do better things, right? But he says that poetry is conducive to virtuous action. So just now he said that poetry can alone, or poetry is alone powerful enough to convey higher level of truth and move people to do that good virtuous actions. So that's how poetry is conducive to virtuous action, and thereby it serves the aim of any branch of study more efficiently. Okay, so the aim of any branch of study is to serve a self-knowledge, thereby move the people to good action. So that is done by poetry more efficiently or most efficiently than any other branch of study. Okay, so that is the first reply to the first allegation. The second allegation is that poetry is the mother of lies. There is nothing true, real in poetry. Poetry is mother of lies. So what he says, that a poet, he affirms nothing and therefore he never lied. So if you are affirming something that this is it, nothing more, nothing else, then you are lying. If that is not true, you are lying. But a poet is a person who writes a poetry, and in his poetry he actually affirms nothing. He actually gives some idea, some higher knowledges. It's up to the readers whether they want to take it or not. So since he is not affirming anything, he is not lying anything. The poet offers not fact but fiction, yet fiction embodying truth of an ideal kind. So what is the major difference between the knowledge that we can find in or facts that we can find in science branches and poetry? That poet offers a kind of fiction, not absolute facts. Yet this fiction, it contains truth of an ideal kind. A higher level of truth is conveyed there, in which poet is not affirming anything. So that's why poet cannot lie in poetry. Here comes the third allegation. Poetry has a wanton or corrupting influence upon people. So the third allegation made against poetry is that poetry has a wanton or corrupting influence. Through its ideas, mainly the youth gets corrupted in a society. So here he says that, see, some poetry are there, like made by false poet, like they are composing such poets that may or may not influence or they may have a bad influence upon people because of this wanton and corrupting influence of poetry, because of that bad poets or because of that bad poetry produced by them. But the fault is not with poetry. So here the fault is not with poetry, but contemporary, some of the contemporary poets, they are abusing poetry. So it's the fault lies with them. So for this reason, some contemporary poets, they are abusing poetry, and those poems have a wanton and corrupting influence upon youth. Then you cannot blame the entire poetry, which is so flourishing and so ancient and so sustaining. You cannot blame the entire poetry for this reason. You have to wisely choose such poets, and you have to blame them for creating such poetry which has wanton and corrupting influence upon people. Okay. Next one is, Plato has banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. So Plato, as a great philosopher, he actually, in one of his utopian works, he says that he will banish poets from his ideal commonwealth. So here Sidney says that Plato is not against poetry but abuse of poetry. So Plato is aware that there are some poets, they are abusing poetry. So Plato is basically against them, abuse of poetry. He is not entirely blaming the poetry, because Plato himself is a born great poet. He has written every other every other philosophical treatise in a poetical way. So he himself is a born poet, and he cannot banish all the poets from his ideal commonwealth because he only referred the abuse of poetry there. And most of his work, especially his work dialogue, is in poetic. So how come Plato can banish the entire entire clan of poets from his ideal commonwealth? So you have to make allegations very wisely. Now we have entered into the last part of this video, last part of Apology of Poetry 2, that in which he says about the reasons for the decline of contemporary English poetry and drama. So in contemporary times, he observes that poetry has declined from its elevated status and people are no more interested in reading, and poets too, they are not producing worthwhile poetry. At the same time, the contemporary stage or drama, they have lost a kind of relevance. Why? What are the reasons for that? So he has given actually 7 reasons. We will discuss one by one. First one is, peaceful years have bred a tame and sluggish generation devoid of the ardent and generous spirit necessary for poetic diction. So he says that in order to create something really worthwhile as a poetry or as a drama, we need a kind of spirit which is ardent and generous. So this particular, the contemporary generation of Philip Sidney, it became so sluggish, lazy and tame. It has no rigorousness. It became so tame in a way that, it actually devoid of any ardent and generous spirit which are necessary for poetic creation, whether it is poetry or drama. How come this happened? Because of the peaceful years. So there were no wars going on. See, the Elizabethan age is the golden age of English literature, where everything was flourishing, not only literature but also science, the nationalism as far as politics is concerned, national feeling among the people also flourishing. So relatively this period was a peaceful period. So this peaceful years termed and made them less rigorous, and it made the people sluggish and lazy, and thereby they are devoid of any ardent and generous spirit which are necessary for poetic creation. So that's the prime reason that Philip Sidney says. The second reason for this decline is, poets are base people and servile wits, worldly and uninspired. See, the poets that we have in this generation, most of them, they are base people. They are materialist kind of people. They don't have any other great thoughts or ideas, or a kind of higher level of spirited thing is missing with the contemporary poets. Okay, so and servile wits, they have very lame wit and they are worldly and they are uninspired. And poetry requires genuine, but genius was lacking in the age. So, poetry requires some kind of genius, to produce worthful poetry or good kind of poetry, better poetry. But it was lacking in this age, as they are worldly, as the poets are worldly, uninspired, and they are witless. The third reason for this decline is, there is widespread ignorance of poetic art. Since see, in the contemporary age of Philip Sidney, we can see drama emerged as the giant genre of this period, not poetry. Poetry was there, even Shakespeare composed sonnets, but still there were a widespread ignorance of poetic art, and poets have neither knowledge nor imitation or sound models nor constant exercise or practice. So if you remember, if you have watched my video about On the Sublime, in which Longinus says that imitating great poets and their great works is one of the major source of sublimity. Thereby you can achieve sublimity in your work. So here says that along with the widespread general ignorance about poetic art, the poets belong to the age, they have neither knowledge, they lack knowledge. That means they don't have great ideas, they don't know how to imitate. Even though they cannot themselves create great ideas, they can look at the great poets and great writers of the past, and they can get inspiration, or they can at least imitate. They can have a sound imitation of sound models. That is also lacking there, and also they are not constantly practicing writing, and they lack everything. They lack all these things. That's why a widespread ignorance about poetic art prevailed during this era. Next reason is that fault of contemporary tragedy. So now he tells about contemporary stage, or especially tragedy. He condemns it for mingling tragic and comic elements, violation of the unities. So he was of the believer that you should not mingle comic and tragic elements within one drama. If it is comic, only comic elements. If it is tragic, then tragic elements should be there. You should not mingle it. You should not a creation of tragic comedy and all. It is actually he condemns it. Philip Sidney condemns it. So the fault of contemporary tragedy is that violation of unities, especially mingling of tragedy and comedy. So he praises, so this you need to note down that he praises in an apology of poetry, that he praises Gorboduc for its elevated style and eloquence proper to tragedy. So he refers Gorboduc. Gorboduc is the first tragedy of English language. So Gorboduc is regarded by Philip Sidney for its, or praised by Philip Sidney for its elevated and eloquence, its beauty as a proper tragedy. Okay, so it actually respects three unities, and in every other sense there is no mingling of comic and tragic elements together. Okay, so that's why. Next, he condemned tragic comedy. So since tragic comedy mingles both tragic and comic elements, then that is an intolerable thing that one should do in a play. So he says that he anyway against the incongruous mixing of tragic and comic elements, and he writes there should be no mingling of kings and clowns. So clowns indicate comic element, kings, they are of serious things. So there should be no mingling of kings and clowns, of born pipes with funeral. You cannot bring together born pipes with funeral, right? So born pipes means a happy mood with a funeral with a sad mood. So you cannot bring together these two entirely different and opposite emotions and moods together in a play, in a work, in a artistic performance. Okay, so that's a extreme violation, and that's why he was completely opposing this kind of an incongruous mixing of tragic and comic elements. Okay, next one is fault of contemporary comedy. He condemns contemporary farcical comedy. So farce means there is nothing profound in it, there is nothing deep in it. It actually creates some momentarily ticklish kind of laughter in farces. Okay, so but comedy, the laughter that we have in comedy is higher level of laughter, or higher level of comic things that we can see there. So he says that contemporary comedies are of like farces. He distinguishes between laughter and delight, and he confutes the current notion that there could be no delight without laughter. So comedy is not only about always you laugh for a joke. It's not comedy. Comedy is something that ends with a positive note. So he mainly talks about, and he distinguishes between laughter and delight. Delight is something more elevated than laughter. Just laughter is not permanent, but delight is more permanent, and laughter is mere scorning, and it's a scornful tickle that we have whenever we hear or see something on the stage. But delight is something which is permanent. Actually, it will move our heart to a higher level. So such kind of delightful, pleasing comedies are lacking in contemporary comedy or stage, and he says that here we can only find some ticklish laughter momentarily throughout the play. That's why he calls the contemporary comedy as farcical. The next reason for the decline is that he further says that comedy should have nothing to do with the painful deformity or things evil and vicious. See, by portraying someone evil and vicious, by citing someone's deformity or disability, a person who is limping, or who's having some hearing problem, or they have some stammering problem. So such deformities should not be addressed, such painful deformities should not be addressed in order to create this kind of scornful, ticklish comedies. They may cause laughter. By portraying this kind of painful deformity, you can create laughter, but they cannot give delight. So these kind of laughters created by showing painful deformity and all, they can create laughter, but they cannot give delight. The proper material for comedy are the weakness, follies and foibles of mankind of a harmless kind. So you have to choose harmless kind of follies, foibles and weaknesses of human beings, and they need to be portrayed to create some kind of delightful laughter which is permanent and long lasting. These are some of the major reasons that he cites about the declining of contemporary drama and poetry. See, I hope this video was helpful for you to understand an apology for poetry in a more sensible manner. He has said many more things too, but I have chosen only the important ones. I have given elaborate thing, the video that is there in the Age of Elizabeth when we were discussing about Philip Sidney. We have already done a video. So, but it comes under literary theory and criticism, so I have done again for you to watch it more comfortably and have only the chunk of the ideas about this particular work by Philip Sidney. So I'm sure this video is going to be helpful in your UGC NET JRF preparations, and if you have written down important points, then you are going to surely remember that. I'm sure about that. And if you have not written, and if you are not in a status to write these things down, then you listen to this audio 1 or 2 times and without skipping, watch the videos properly. Okay, at least you can do that. Okay, so don't forget to visit my website www.highpoint.in if you are interested to have a systematic studies towards your NET JRF preparations, because a 15% off is going on. So don't miss this chance and join our course and have the bonuses like weekly test and personalized study guidelines. At the same time, you can also have 300 plus downloadable PDF materials and live attemptable previous and practice question papers in the website that you can attempt as many times as possible. So once you join the course, make use the entire facilities that we have given there. Okay. And also you can WhatsApp me or call me in order to know more about our course and also about NET JRF English language and literature in general. And also if you want to know more about the WhatsApp group, and if you want to join that WhatsApp group, then you can obviously go to the description box and click the link and join it, or if not, you can message me. I'll share you the link and you can join freely along with your friends. And don't forget to follow me in Instagram, because I'm sharing lot of free materials in the form of quiz questions are there in my story, and also study cards, short videos, reels and many more things we are planning in 2022. So don't forget to follow me there. And if you are also there Instagram, and if you are not there Instagram, you can obviously download it in your phone and you can have it, and you can every day you can see some points related to English language and literature if you are following me. Okay, so if you have any doubts, queries, questions and suggestion, please mention all that in the comment section along with your major takeaway, major things that you have learned from this video lecture under the comment section, because that will guide the future students of this video series further to watch this video more. And and that will also give me an information about that you are really watching this video and having a benefit out of it. So anyway, let's meet in the next video section. And if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so that you don't have to miss any of the notifications whenever I'm uploading a video. So that's all about it. Meet you in the next video session. Until then, bye bye and thank you.